Let's write out the reaction for photosynthesis, and it's not going to be balanced. This equation won't be balanced. Sometimes all those numbers can just confuse people. So water plus carbon dioxide will yield sugar and oxygen. This is glucose. This is diatomic oxygen gas. That's a waste product. So you've got two inorganic substances producing an organic substance. And this happens in plants, cyanobacteria, some protozoans that have chloroplasts. So looking at this, we're going to look at two major steps. Let me divide this out. I'm dividing out what is known as the chloroplast. You can look at a picture of a chloroplast in a textbook to see that there are two major parts to it. One part is the stroma, and the stroma is the area that's filled with a thick fluid, thick with enzymes that are driving all of these metabolic pathways we're going to be talking about. And then stacks of grana, and these stacks of grana are really just these little thylakoid membranes where this first reaction is going to occur. So photosynthesis takes place in two different spots. The first one we're talking about happens on the thylakoid membrane. Now, what do you know about a membrane? How would you describe a membrane?
Phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins.
So the phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins. These embedded proteins are important because we're going to have a channel protein that's an embedded protein, and then proteins that are going to hand off electrons down an electron transport system. So embedded in the membrane of the thylakoid. So this reaction on the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast is called the light-dependent reaction. It needs sunlight, and I'm going to put that above the arrow, along with all kinds of enzymes catalyzing reactions for all of these. The sun's energy to drive the light-dependent reactions. And there's two light-dependent reactions. And they both rely on the pigment chlorophyll. You can look at a picture of the chlorophyll molecule. And when we're talking about this energy from the sun, we're talking about the little packets of energy traveling on wavelengths. And those little packets of energy are called photons. And the photons excite these photosystems I'm going to talk about. So we have photosystem 1. And a photon will excite the photosystem 1 pigment that uses the wavelength of energy from 700 nanometer wavelength of red light. And then there's photosystem 2. That uses the 680 nanometer wavelength of energy from the sun. The photon excites that photosystem, and when you excite a photosystem, electrons are going to get energized and then jump out of the system into this membrane protein, and I need my pictures here, membrane protein channel where they will fall down the ETS and eventually go back to their photosystems. So photons are important because that's the energy coming from the sun exciting these photosystems. This light-dependent reaction, we're going to make some products that we're using over here in the stroma for what's called the light-independent reaction. Back in the olden days when I was in school, this was called the dark reaction. But it didn't have to happen in the dark. It just didn't need light. So they changed it to the light-independent reaction. what this reaction does need, which is happening out in the stroma, it needs the products that I'm going to be talking about that happens here in the light-dependent reaction. So in our photosystem 1, electrons get excited, and when they get excited, they're going to jump up, and they're going to fall down this cytochrome system, and then go back into their pigment 700 nanometer. So they're continually jumping up when they're excited and falling back. So you've got this cyclic photophosphorylation. I'm going to write over here just because I'm running out of space. And what's phosphorylation? What's phosphorylation?
Adding a phosphate group to a molecule.
When you're adding a phosphate group to a molecule. So because if you've got this sun's energy exciting the electron, this photoelectric effect, the electrons are jumping, going down, being passed down the cytochrome system. At the same time, you've got hydrogen ions being pumped across the reservoir. At the point in this thylakoid membrane, you've got one of these protein channels that hydrogen ions are going to rush through. And when these hydrogen ions rush through it, a phosphate gets added to an ADP. And do you know what ADP is? Adenosine diphosphate. And when you get another phosphate group attached to it, then it's called
Adenosine triphosphate.
yeah, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. We've just made some adenosine triphosphate in this photosystem 1, the cyclic photophosphorylation. Now what's being cycled? What's being cycled here?
The pigment.
The pigment is where the electrons get excited in this pigment, and it's the electrons. Yep, the electrons are being cycled. So cyclic photophosphorylation. And you're only making a little bit of ATP with this cyclic photophosphorylation in photosystem 1. But that still is a form of this chemiosmotic, because it is that hydrogen ion gradient that's going to drive the reaction to add a phosphate group to ADP, making ATP. So we got one ATP here with this system. Now this is a pretty primitive system. Since the development of this, the photosystem 2 has evolved